600 artillery pieces fired in a single hour, not a single day, 1 hour. And when the smoke cleared, 26,000 American boys would be dead before it was over, more than any battle before or since in the entire history of the United States military. Not Normandy, not Iwo Jima, not Gettysburg, a forest in France that most Americans have never heard of. This is the story of the battle the United States Army was never supposed to be able to fight, let alone win, in the 47 days that turned a nation of farmers and factory workers into the force that ended the First World War. Late September 1918, a young private presses his body into the mud of a forest so dense that officers cannot see their own men 10 feet away. Machine gun fire rips through the tree line from positions the Germans have spent 4 years perfecting. Somewhere ahead, an entire American battalion has vanished into the trees, cut off, surrounded, out of food, out of water, shelled by their own artillery because no one can tell where the front line even is anymore. This is not the battle you were taught in school. This is Meuse-Argonne, and before we show you how it ends, you need to understand how impossible it was for it to ever begin. Rewind 3 years. In 1915, the United States Army ranked 17th in the world in size, smaller than Portugal's. It had no tanks. It had almost no modern artillery. Its officers had last fought a major war against each other, wearing blue and gray, half a century earlier, while the armies of Europe were being butchered by the millions in trenches that stretched from the English Channel to the Swiss border. America watched from across an ocean and told itself this was not its war to fight. Then came the telegram. In January 1917, a coded message from the German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann to Mexico was intercepted and decoded by British intelligence. Germany was offering Mexico an alliance, promising to help it reclaim Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona if the United States entered the war. Public outrage exploded across the country. Add to that Germany's resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking merchant and passenger ships without warning, and the pressure became unbearable. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. There was only one problem. America had almost no army to send. What followed was one of the most staggering mobilizations in human history. In the span of 18 months, the United States built an army from nearly nothing. Farm boys from Kansas who had never left their county were handed rifles and shipped to training camps built almost overnight. Factory workers from Pittsburgh were taught to march in formation within weeks of enlisting. By the time the guns fell silent in November 1918, over 4 million Americans had been put into uniform, and more than 2 million of them had crossed the Atlantic into a war zone that had already consumed a generation of European men. General John J. Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Force, made a decision that infuriated the exhausted British and French commanders. He refused to let American troops be broken up and fed piecemeal into French and British units as replacements. He insisted on an independent American army fighting under an American flag commanded by American generals. The French and British thought this was reckless arrogance from a nation that had never fought a modern war. Pershing thought it was the only way America would ever be taken seriously as a power. Both of them were about to find out who was right in the worst possible classroom. By the autumn of 1918, the war had ground into its final phase. Germany's spring offensives, its last desperate gamble to win the war before American manpower could fully arrive, had failed. The German army was exhausted, its supply lines strained, its soldiers increasingly demoralized. But it was not broken. It still held a fortified defensive network that had taken 4 years to build, and nowhere was that network more formidable than in a 60-mile stretch of eastern France between the Meuse River and the Argonne Forest. This was not open countryside. This was a nightmare built by engineers. Steep, wooded ridges, ravines choked with underbrush, rivers and streams that turned to mud with every rainfall. And running through and around all of it, a labyrinth of German defensive lines with names that would become synonymous with slaughter. The Giselhurst Stellung, the Kriemhilde Stellung, layered one behind another, each one bristling with concrete machine gun nests, barbed wire fields 100 yards deep, and artillery observation posts perched on hilltops that could see for miles in every direction. German commanders had spent 4 years turning this landscape into a killing machine, and they had chosen it because they believed no army on earth could break through it. They were nearly right. The Allied High Command needed a knockout blow before winter, before the Germans could dig in for another year of stalemate, before political will in Paris and London and Washington could collapse under the weight of endless casualties. The plan was audacious in its scope, a series of coordinated offensives across the entire Western Front designed to shatter German supply lines all at once. The American sector, the Meuse-Argonne, was assigned what may have been the single most difficult objective on the entire front, a direct assault into the most heavily fortified terrain the German army possessed, with the goal of cutting the vital Sedan-Mazières railway that supplied nearly the entire German army in France. Cut that railway, and the German war machine in the West would starve. Here is how you build an offensive meant to break an unbreakable line. First, you gather more artillery than has ever been assembled by an American force in history, nearly 3,000 guns, and you feed them enough shells to fire over 1 million rounds in a single preparatory barrage. You do this at night, in complete secrecy, moving 600,000 men, thousands of guns, and hundreds of tanks into position in the span of about 2 weeks, an achievement so logistically complex that French officers who witnessed it did not believe it was possible. You choose your moment, the pre-dawn darkness of September 26, 1918. You unleash your barrage first, an apocalypse of shellfire designed to shatter the enemy's nerve and cut his wire. Then, before the sun fully rises, you send your infantry forward into fog, smoke, and a landscape churned into a moonscape of craters, forcing men to advance blind through terrain the enemy has spent years learning by heart, while your own soldiers see it for the very first time. The barrage began at 2:30 in the morning. For nearly 3 hours, the horizon burned. Villages that had stood for centuries were erased in minutes. German soldiers deep in their concrete bunkers felt the earth itself shudder beneath them. And then, at dawn, out of the smoke, came 9 American divisions, more than 200,000 men, advancing on a front over 20 miles wide, the largest offensive in American military history up to that point, and one that remains among the largest ever undertaken by the United States Army to this day. The first day brought stunning gains. Confused and battered German defenders fell back, and American units pushed forward faster than almost anyone expected, but this was where the illusion of an easy victory shattered completely. Many of the American divisions thrown into this assault were green, inexperienced, some having never fired a shot in anger before this morning. Roads collapsed under the weight of traffic. Supply lines snarled into chaos. And as the Americans pushed deeper, they ran headlong into the 2nd and 3rd German defensive belts, manned by veteran troops who understood exactly how to make an attacker pay for every yard of ground. Then the forest began to swallow men whole. The Argonne itself, dense, tangled, ancient woodland, became one of the deadliest environments American soldiers had ever fought in. Visibility dropped to a few feet in places. Officers lost contact with their own companies. German machine gunners, hidden in fortified positions built over years, could hold off entire battalions from a single concealed nest. And it was here, in the deepest, darkest part of this forest, that one of the most harrowing episodes of the entire war unfolded, a story so remarkable it would outlive the battle itself. On October 2nd, roughly 550 men under Major Charles Whittlesey pushed forward into a ravine, believing friendly units were advancing on their flanks. They were wrong. German forces closed in behind them, and in a matter of hours, these men found themselves completely surrounded, cut off from all supply, all reinforcement, all hope of retreat. They would become known to history as the Lost Battalion, though they were never truly lost, only abandoned by circumstance in the worst possible place at the worst possible time. For nearly a week, these men held a shallow depression in the forest floor while German forces attacked from every direction. They ran out of food within days. Clean water disappeared just as fast, forcing desperate men to crawl to a nearby stream under sniper fire, knowing many would not crawl back. American artillery, trying to support them, instead rained shells down onto their own position because no one could pinpoint their exact coordinates in the dense woodland. Of the roughly 550 men who entered that ravine, fewer than 200 would walk out unwounded when the ordeal finally ended. A single carrier pigeon, released in desperation to stop the friendly fire falling on their heads, is credited with saving what remained of the unit, flying through a hail of gunfire to deliver its message before collapsing from its wounds after landing. Back home in the United States, none of this was fully understood as it happened. Newspapers printed brief, censored dispatches, weeks old by the time they reached American breakfast tables. Families received telegrams, not details. Mothers in Ohio and fathers in Georgia knew only that their sons were somewhere in France, in something called the Argonne, and that the casualty lists kept growing longer with every edition of the paper. War bond drives intensified. Factories that had converted from peacetime production ran around the clock, turning out shells, rifles, and boots for an army that consumed supplies faster than anyone at home could fully grasp. This was the first time in generations that the United States had asked its entire population, not just its soldiers, to carry the weight of a war being fought an ocean away, and the strain of it was reshaping the country itself, even as its sons bled in a forest few of them could have located on a map. If you think that was the worst of it, you have not yet seen what was waiting on the ridge above Montfaucon. Montfaucon rose out of the landscape like a fortress built by nature and perfected by German engineers, a hill so heavily fortified with tunnels, bunkers, and observation posts that German Kaiser Wilhelm himself had once watched the earlier Battle of Verdun unfold from its summit. American commanders had promised to take this hill on the very first day of the offensive. It did not fall until the second day, and only after brutal, grinding combat that exposed just how unprepared some American units still were for the realities of industrial warfare. Every ridge like Montfaucon had to be taken the same brutal way: direct assault, artillery support, and staggering casualties, because there was no way around this terrain, only through it. Pershing was forced to make a painful decision. In the middle of the offensive, exhausted and depleted divisions had to be pulled from the line and replaced with fresh troops, a logistical nightmare conducted under fire, in the mud, in the rain that turned every road into a river of sludge. Trucks sank to their axles. Horses died by the thousands hauling supply wagons through terrain never meant to carry this much weight and steel. And still, day after day, the advance continued, mile after brutal mile, ridge after fortified ridge. By mid-October, something remarkable was happening beneath the mud and blood and chaos. The green American divisions that had stumbled and bled through the opening days were learning, adapting, hardening into veterans in real time. Younger officers, thrust into command after their superiors were killed or wounded, began to master the brutal choreography of trench warfare, coordinating artillery, machine guns, and infantry advances with a skill that had taken European armies years of catastrophic losses to develop. America was paying, in blood, for 4 years of catch-up in a matter of weeks. And then, on October 14th, the Americans threw themselves at the Kriemhilde Stellung, the strongest single segment of the entire German defensive network. A line the Germans had told their own soldiers was unbreakable. It took days of ferocious, grinding combat, hill by hill, bunker by bunker, but by October 16th, elements of the American line had punched through it. The unbreakable line had broken. Nowhere was the human cost and the human courage more visible than in the story of one man who would become the single most decorated American soldier of the entire war. Alvin York, a former conscientious objector from the hills of Tennessee who had once tried to avoid the draft on religious grounds, found himself on October 8th leading a small patrol that stumbled directly into a heavily defended German position. In the chaos that followed, with most of his patrol dead or pinned down, York alone advanced on a German machine gun nest, using cover and marksmanship honed from a lifetime of hunting in the Appalachian Mountains, and captured an almost unbelievable number of German soldiers, somewhere in the range of 132 men, along with dozens of machine guns, largely by himself. His story would later become legend, but in the fall of 1918, it was simply one more example of ordinary American farm boys doing the extraordinary, because the situation demanded nothing less. This was not a war fought by white American soldiers alone, and pretending otherwise would betray the truth of what happened in these forests. Regiments of African American soldiers, serving in a segregated army that too often denied them equipment, recognition, and even basic dignity, fought and died in this campaign. Some of them decorated by the French government with honors their own country was slow to acknowledge. Native American soldiers, including Choctaw code talkers, used their native language over field telephones to transmit orders the Germans could not decipher, a tactic so effective it would be revived and expanded a generation later in the Second World War. This offensive was not won by any single kind of American. It was won by all of them, together, in the mud. And it was not won by Americans alone. French colonial troops, some of them from as far away as Senegal and Morocco, fought and died on the flanks of this offensive, absorbing German counterattacks that might otherwise have crashed directly into exhausted American lines. French artillery crews, veterans of Verdun and the Somme, provided firepower and expertise the newly arrived Americans desperately needed, but did not yet possess. This was, in every sense, a coalition battle, fought by men from different continents, speaking different languages, united only by the grim understanding that this forest had to be taken, whatever it cost, or the war would drag on into a fifth catastrophic year that neither side could survive. By late October, the Argonne Forest itself, the tangled, murderous woodland that had swallowed the Lost Battalion and countless others, was finally cleared. French forces on the American flank, fighting their own brutal parallel battle, helped secure the advance. The German High Command, watching their strongest defensive positions crumble one after another, began to understand what before had seemed unthinkable. The war was slipping away from them, not in some distant future, but now, in these very weeks. If you think the story ends there, with a clean, triumphant breakthrough, you are wrong, and that is exactly what makes what happens next so remarkable. Even after the Kriemhildestellung fell, the fighting did not stop, did not slow, did not become easy. German forces fell back to new positions and kept fighting with the same discipline and lethality that had made this front a graveyard for 200,000 American casualties across the entire campaign, wounded and killed combined. Early November brought a final push, American divisions racing toward the Meuse River itself, attempting to seize crossings under fire in the war's final days, some soldiers falling in combat mere hours before the guns would finally fall silent forever. Men died on November 10th, and even into the early hours of November 11th, some of them killed by artillery fire ordered simply because commanders wanted their units to hold better ground when the ceasefire took effect, a grim, largely forgotten footnote to a war that had already consumed so much. And then, at 11 o'clock in the morning, on the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, it stopped. Silence fell across a landscape that had not known silence in over 4 years. Soldiers who had spent weeks flinching at every distant boom stood in stunned disbelief as the guns simply went quiet. Some wept. Some laughed. Some could not process it at all and kept their heads down out of pure instinct for hours afterward, unable to believe the killing had actually ended. The numbers that came out of the Meuse-Argonne Offensive remain almost incomprehensible even now, more than a century later. Over 1 million American soldiers took part in the campaign across its 47-day duration, the largest single operation in the history of the United States Army. American casualties, killed and wounded combined, exceeded 120,000 men. 26,000 of those men never came home at all, making this the deadliest battle in American military history, more costly in American lives than the Battle of the Bulge, more costly than Iwo Jima, more costly than any single battle of the Civil War. And yet it remains one of the least remembered chapters of American military history, overshadowed in popular memory by the wars that followed it. But the cost purchased something irreversible. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive shattered the German army's ability to continue fighting on the Western Front. It severed critical supply lines the German war machine depended on. It proved, beyond any doubt the German High Command could still cling to, that American manpower and industrial capacity had arrived on the battlefield in overwhelming, decisive force, and that this force was only going to grow larger the longer the war continued. Within weeks of the offensive's brutal climax, the German government, facing military collapse abroad and revolution at home, sought an armistice. The war that had consumed an entire generation of Europe's young men came to an end, in no small part because of what had happened in a forest. Most of the men who fought there could not have found on a map before they were sent to die in it. The young private who pressed himself into the mud at the start of this story, the soldiers of the Lost Battalion, who survived on faith and a single wounded pigeon, Alvin York walking alone toward a machine gun nest, the Choctaw soldiers speaking a language older than the nation that sent them to fight, the segregated regiments who bled for a country that would not yet call them equal citizens, all of them became part of something that changed how the world understood American power forever. Before the Meuse-Argonne, the world saw the United States as an untested, unproven latecomer to a war fought by ancient empires. After it, no one doubted that America could build an army from nothing, throw it against the most fortified positions on Earth, and break them, whatever the cost. Today, a cemetery near the small French town of Romagne holds more American dead than any other American military cemetery on Earth, over 14,000 crosses and stars of David, row after silent row, stretching across ground that was once churned into a wasteland of shell craters and barbed wire. Most visitors to France never see it. Most Americans have never heard its name. And yet every single one of those graves represents a young man who, weeks earlier, had been a farmer, a clerk, a student, an immigrant barely settled into a new country, transformed almost overnight into a soldier asked to walk into machine gun fire in a forest on the other side of the world. The forest has grown back now. Walk through the Argonne today and you will find peace, birdsong, dappled sunlight through the trees, almost nothing to suggest that a century ago this ground swallowed tens of thousands of young men in a matter of weeks. But beneath that quiet forest floor lies the answer to a question that once seemed impossible: whether a nation of farmers, factory workers, and immigrants, thrown into the deadliest war the world had ever seen, could stand toe-to-toe with the most battle-hardened armies on Earth and come out the other side, having changed the course of history forever. The Meuse-Argonne gave its answer in blood, in mud, in 47 of the longest days in American military history, and that answer echoes, quietly, in every ridge and hollow of that forest still.